So there's a very famous experiment in which rats were bioengineered to not have dopamine receptors in the reward pathway of the brain. And what the scientists discovered was that if they put food into the rat's mouth, the rat would eat the food and seem to get pleasure from the food. But if they put the food even, a single body length away, the rat would starve to death. In other words, we need dopamine not just for the experience of pleasure, but also for the motivation to do the work, to go get the reward. And probably the way that dopamine makes us motivated is to create this dopamine deficit state, or those gremlins on the pain side of the balance.
So what happens when we transport this brain that evolved over millions of years into the modern environment where everything is now available at the touch of a button?
This ancient wiring that has us experiencing pain in the immediate aftermath of pleasure is woefully mismatched for our modern ecosystem. Why? Because we are surrounded by pleasure. We have more access to more reinforcing drugs and behaviors than at any point in human history. Even things that previously, you could have thought of as healthy, like reading or exercise or playing games, has become drugified, has been turned into a drug in some way, making us all more vulnerable to the problem of addiction, and also making us more vulnerable to the problem of this dopamine deficit state whereby our brains try to compensate for this excess of pleasure by downregulating our own dopamine production and transmission, not just to baseline, but below baseline, creating this constant physiologic craving for more pleasure, but also the things that go along with craving, which are anxiety, irritability, and depression.
So the mechanisms in our brain that compel us to, approach pleasure and avoid pain, you say were evolved over millions of years for a world of scarcity. Whereas today, because we're surrounded by so much stuff, we're sort of drinking from a fire hose of dopamine, as you put it.
Yeah, it's the plenty paradox, right? It's the literal physiologic stress of overabundance.
So walk me through the same seesaw analogy that we talked about earlier. Again, 100,000 years ago, I found a date tree, and the date tree had delicious dates, and it made my brain very happy to eat some of those dates, but there were not very many dates on that one tree. I had to find the next tree, and the next tree might have been, as you say, 3 miles away, and so it required a huge amount of effort to get to that next date tree. What's happening with that seesaw now in the world in which we live, where things are in fact available at the touch of a button?
Yeah, well, let's go back for a second and talk about what's happening with the seesaw when you're looking for the date tree. Because what happens as you're scouring your environment to try to find, one date tree with a couple of dates on it, is that your pleasure-pain balance goes onto the pain side, right? Because you're hungry and you're walking and you're tired. And then finally you find this date tree and you're ecstatic and you eat this date, and your balance, your pleasure-pain balance, goes back to the level position, which feels like euphoria, because part of the key here is the directionality of the pleasure-pain balance. So if I'm in pain because I'm hungry, and then I find something to eat and it moves me in the direction of pleasure, that's as pleasurable as if I start out with a level balance and I use an intoxicant and I get high.
Interesting. And so now the same pain, pleasure balance now, what happens now?
Yeah, so now in the modern world, let's say, take Silicon Valley because it's a prime example, but it's also true all over the world now. You go and you're hungry, right? And you're looking for a date tree. And all of a sudden, you've got like a whole crate of dates shipped to you from Amazon right on your kitchen table, right? And by the way, they're giant, they're like abnormally giant dates, right? So you eat a giant date from Amazon, and, it releases dopamine in your reward pathway because they've also added sugar and salt and fat and flavorings. It's like coffee dates or something, who knows? And you get the release of dopamine, and wow, that feels great because wow, who's ever had a date like that in the history of humans? And then, as soon as it's over, your pleasure-pain balance tips to the side of pain because those gremlins are trying to compensate for all that dopamine. And as soon as you're in that dopamine deficit state with the gremlins on the pain side of the balance, you want to restore a level balance. And what is the easiest way to do that? Well, you could wait until the gremlins hop off, because if you wait long enough, they will hop off and homeostasis will be restored. Or you could eat another date. And if you eat another date, because there's a whole crate of dates right in front of you, that would work faster, right? And maybe you'll eat 2 this time, because then that'll level your balance, but also get you over to the pleasure side. And pretty soon you've eaten the whole crate of dates. And now you're essentially at war with those neuroadaptation gremlins.